The man was frozen to the bone, halfway up the hill, too stubborn to knock even as the frost on his beard turned yellow from the lantern light leaking under the widow's warped doorframe. He stood there, silent and ashamed, gripping a wool blanket tight over his shoulders like a shawl, shivering not just from the wind but from what it had come to, for a grown man, one of Ridgway's most vocal, standing outside her house, the same house he once called a crooked shame of timber, dirt, and a woman's delusion, and now he needed to get inside it. From behind the door came a dull creaking. Not footsteps, no, something beneath the floorboards, something sliding, then the sound of a kettle's faint rumble, and the unmistakable warmth of heat. Not smoke, not firewood, not even coal, just dry, breathable, impossible warmth, while every other cabin in the valley lay trapped in a frozen hell where pipes burst, windows cracked, and even the sheriff's prize stove coughed itself cold before midnight. Inside that strange cabin on the rise, a widow's pointless invention was doing the unthinkable, but no one wanted to believe it, not until now. Evelyn Drew hadn't planned to make enemies in Ridgway. Truth be told, she hadn't planned much of anything after burying her husband. She'd arrived with 3 trunks, a sick mule, and the letters her husband wrote her while working timber 2 years before he died. And when she found out his claim had been misfiled, and the cabin promised in his last letter belonged to another man now, she bought what no one else wanted, a collapsed trapper's shack on a wind-blasted ridge 2 miles from town. "You can't plant a garden on that slope," they warned. "No root'll hold in that wind. The sun hits too late. It's cursed ground." They weren't wrong. Her first winter nearly killed her. The stove smoked out the rafters even with the flue open, and the cracks in the floor made her boots colder inside than they were in snow. Even under 4 quilts and a pile of stitched-up coats, she could feel the night air tugging at her bones. She slept with a hat on and woke with frost on her lashes. But she did notice something strange. On the north wall, where the old stovepipe once ran but now lay sealed, she kept a stack of drying cloths. They stayed warmer than the floor near the fire. She couldn't understand it. No sun hit that corner. No fire reached it. Yet somehow the air circulated. She thought it was just her imagination, but she started to watch. In the dead of night, with breath hanging like smoke, she'd feel warm drafts crawling through the gaps in the floor. Not cold air, but upward warmth. And then she remembered something her husband once wrote. "Cold can trap heat like a blanket, if you're smart enough to trick it." In spring, while the rest of Ridgway was planting seed potatoes or fixing fence lines, Evelyn Drew disappeared into the dirt. She didn't say much, just gathered stones, scrap wood, a dented shovel, and an old tin washtub. Some said she'd lost her mind. Others said she was digging a grave for herself. The children of Ridgway watched her from a distance as she dug into the hill behind her cabin. Not down, but under. Not a cellar, not really. It had no stairs, no walls, just a sloping tunnel no taller than a wheelbarrow. The mayor's wife called it a rabbit hole for madness. By summer, it had vanished under a thick patch of turf and a ring of stone. To the casual eye, it looked like a flattened mound, like nothing at all. But beneath, Evelyn had laid the foundation of her experiment, a buried chamber, shaped like a shallow bowl, connected to narrow tunnels that led upward toward the underside of her cabin. She hauled ash and cinders from town and layered them deep in the bowl, then gravel, then clay. She spent a week alone packing earth like she was sealing a vault. The children called it the witch's pot. The men called it a waste of labor. But come first snow, Evelyn's cabin didn't smoke. It didn't smell of burning wood. And on the coldest morning, a peddler passing through town swore he saw heat rising from her roof without a chimney puff. No one believed him. Not yet. Then came the freeze of '81, a storm not just long, but strange. No clouds for days, just biting wind that howled like sandpaper through the pines. By the second night, folks were already burning spare furniture to keep warm. Stoves couldn't hold heat. Pipes froze solid even before sundown. The town's tavern, the only place with a coal heater, was packed wall to wall, but even that couldn't hold warmth by midnight. People started to whisper about Evelyn Drew's cabin. "She's not burning a single log," someone muttered. "She's not even seen in town," said another. "How the hell is she still alive?" That's when the grocer's son took his brother and hiked to her ridge. They came back pale, eyes wide, faces raw from wind, but alive. "It's warm, Pa," the boy said. "Like summer. No fire, no coal, just heat from the floor." "You're imagining it," the father said. "Then why ain't she frozen like the rest of us?" The mayor refused to acknowledge it. The preacher said it bordered on witchcraft. But by the 4th night, when frost curled like claws around every window pane in town, and a child nearly died in her sleep from the cold despite being buried under 3 quilts, one man left his house in silence, walked the snowy road alone, and stood beneath Evelyn's door with his pride in one hand and a prayer in the other. And inside, beneath that creaky floor, A pointless experiment was doing the one thing no man's furnace could, holding stable warmth night after night, from nothing but earth, air, and a woman's refusal to die in silence. She let him in without a word, not because she pitied him. Evelyn Drew had long since lost the softness in her voice when dealing with the men of Ridgeway, but because she knew what it meant when one of them came knocking. It meant someone in town was close to freezing. It meant they'd burned through what coal they had and watched smoke curl in their cabin without heat behind it. It meant they no longer cared how strange her home was or how pointless her work had looked while they spat tobacco and laughed down at her slope from their porches. He stepped in slow, like a thief, holding his hands against the heat with something like fear. It wasn't just warm, it was unnaturally warm, but not in any way he could explain. There was no smell of fire, no tang of coal smoke or oily soot, no crackle of logs, just a soft, consistent glow rising from the floorboards, faint and dry, like summer earth on a sunlit day. And it made no damn sense. She didn't offer him a chair. There was only one, and she sat in it. Instead, she nodded at a wooden stool by the wall, and he took it, silent. His name was Mark Whitlow. He'd been one of the first settlers in Ridgeway, a loudmouth with a sharp coat and a sharper tongue. He was the same man who once called Evelyn's digging a woman's version of carpentry, just dirtier. Now he sat hunched, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug she handed him, steam rising gently from the surface. "What is it?" he asked, nodding toward the floor. His voice cracked. She didn't look at him. She sipped her tea, slow and steady. "I told you all," she said finally. "You just didn't listen. It's not a stove." He was blinking now, trying to see through the floorboards, like they might reveal something. "No, it ain't coal? No, and it's not magic, is it?" That made her smile, the kind of smile that comes from watching someone choke on their pride. "No, Mark, it's not magic, it's air." He stared. "Warm air, from underground, and pressure, that's it. You're telling me this heat? It's just the ground doing this? I'm telling you it's movement, air moving in ways you all never cared to notice. It's insulation, yes, but more than that, it's the way the cold traps the heat and pulls it in under your feet. If you dig the right way, if you shape the ground right and seal it with clay and ash and give it the right path to rise, it rises, all on its own." He looked like a man trying to read a new language upside down. "You buried a stove under the cabin?" She shook her head. "No fire, just earth, just air moving from down to up, slow and steady. And all I had to do was make a space to hold it." He looked around the room. No smoke, no fire, just a slow haze of golden warmth curling along the cabin walls like a blanket. It was impossible, or at least it had been, and that was the beginning. Within 2 days, 3 more men came knocking, not alone, always with excuses. "Thought we'd check." "On you, ma'am. Make sure you hadn't froze to death." "Got word your roof might need a patch. Thought we'd lend a hand." "Just passing through. Figured we'd say hello." She let them in or didn't, depending on how they'd treated her in spring. But what none of them could deny, what every single one of them felt the moment their boots crossed the threshold, was that Evelyn's cabin was at least 30 degrees warmer than any building in Ridgeway, and she hadn't burned a single log. Word spread. Not fast, not loud, but like rot under bark, quiet and unavoidable. And as the cold held the town tighter in its grip, as snow gathered like tombstones over roofs and even the tavern's walls began to sweat and freeze over, more and more folks turned their eyes to the strange widow on the ridge. But pride is a hard thing to swallow. They didn't ask for help. They asked questions, backhanded, careful ones. "You got some sort of new stove in there, Evelyn?" "No." "You use some foreign trick? One of them mining gadgets?" "No." "You got a man staying with you? Someone who knows heat?" She laughed once, sharp and bitter. "No, gentlemen. Just a woman who watched, listened, and tried something you all said couldn't be done." And that was when the anger began, because it wasn't enough for her to be right. It was the fact that she had tried, and that they hadn't, that she had dared to dig into the very dirt they all ignored and found something worth more than firewood. The preacher spoke of unnatural heat, of spirits that whispered through hollow earth. One man said he'd seen blue lights over her roof at night. Another said she must have found an old Comanche burial chamber and the dead were keeping her warm. But then a child died in her sleep from the cold, and the whispers stopped. Her cabin filled by necessity, not invitation. On the 9th night of the freeze, when even the bark on the trees split from cold and glass shattered in 3 homes just from pressure, a wagon rolled slow and desperate up the slope. Inside were 2 children, a woman barely breathing, and the town's oldest widow, Mrs. Holbrook, who hadn't left her own bed in 4 years. Evelyn opened the door. They said nothing. They didn't have to. She moved her table, laid down quilts, let them sleep on the floor, warm from beneath, let them breathe without seeing their breath, let them live. And the next night, 2 more came, then 5, then 7. Her cabin held 16 souls that week, some sleeping upright, some curled beneath shelves, children sleeping with their cheeks pressed to the floorboards like they were hugging summer. None of them spoke of it in town, but something had changed. When the snow finally broke, 3 weeks later, the town held a meeting. They didn't call it what it was, of course. They called it a gathering of good folk to discuss future preparations. But the truth of it was plain. They needed Evelyn Drew. They needed her to explain the heat, to replicate it, to teach it. Because in Ridgeway, 33 degrees meant life. She showed them sketches, diagrams, explained how she'd buried clay in a wide bowl beneath the house, how she'd built sloped tunnels from the fire pit in the yard. Not for fire, but to draw cold in and force heat to rise through layered gravel and ash. How she sealed every seam with mud and turf and built the house on top of it like a lid. How the whole thing only worked because she had planned it to, not by accident, but by stubborn, thankless experiment. It's not magic, she said once more. It's not even invention. It's just watching how the earth already moves and giving it a path. They didn't understand most of it, but they wanted to, and that was the start. By the end of the winter, 3 new cabins had begun construction. Though the ground was still frozen, they dug anyway, following her sketches. None of them gave her credit, not directly, but they used her measurements. They mimicked her vent shafts. They borrowed her clay and ash mixture, though they called it insulation to save face. A year later, the mayor's own cabin had no stove, and in the next freeze, it held at 47 degrees when the rest of town barely saw 10. No one called it pointless anymore. What no one ever saw, though, what Evelyn never showed on her sketches, was the notebook. Tucked behind the warped boards of her dresser, sealed in oilskin and bound with cloth, the small journal contained every note she'd made that first frozen winter, and every failure. It recorded how she'd tried burying coals, but they suffocated. How she'd built a pit with a pipe, but it funneled cold instead. How she'd burned her hands trying to create airflow with heated stones. How she nearly died in her first attempt when the roof collapsed from a miscalculated support beam. No one saw those pages. No one wanted to know that her success came from months of near-death work, from bruises and frostbite, and a grief that had hollowed her into something sharper than most could understand. They only saw the warmth, the miracle, the 33 degrees. No one asked her why she had done it. They were too busy copying her, and it was easier to pretend it had all been some lucky guess, some strange quirk of the land, or a woman's random success no one could explain, than to face what had really happened, that Evelyn Drew had seen death coming from the trees, from the sky, from the white void of that ridgewind winter. And instead of praying, she had calculated. She had fought back with inches of soil and tricks of air. But even as others built their own versions of her strange system, misunderstood copies of her original form, Evelyn knew most of them would fail because they weren't really listening. They were building warmth without knowing the cold. She remembered the night it came to her, not the theory, not the shape, but the feeling that made her do it. She'd been lying awake beneath a sagging quilt with her husband's coat over her chest, her boots still on, her breath puffing white into the air. The fire had died again, and she didn't have the strength to relight it. Her fingers were too stiff, her knees ached. She'd been crying without knowing it, and that was the night she felt the warmth, not from the hearth, not from any fire, but from the floor behind her, in the dark corner where the chimney had once connected, a curl of dry air, like a hand brushing the edge of her spine. She thought it was a ghost at first. She even whispered a thank you to her dead husband, but it wasn't that. It was airflow, and if the earth could be made to move, if the cold could be made to draw the heat upward, like a siphon, then maybe she didn't need logs, maybe she didn't need coal, maybe she didn't need anyone, and maybe that was what scared them most. The second winter after the freeze came fast. It wasn't as cold, but it was stranger. Ice came early, before the trees dropped their last leaves. The soil locked solid beneath the boots of men still trying to lay pipe or trench for drainage. The clouds didn't look like snow, just grey sheets pressed so low you could swear they scraped the rooftops. And Evelyn was prepared. But Ridgeway wasn't, because half the men who had promised to build new systems based on hers had cut corners. They hadn't packed the clay tight enough. They'd used raw dirt instead of layered ash. They'd skipped the top insulation layer altogether, assuming the snow would do the job. And some didn't bother building their homes on top of the heat pit, choosing instead to make the system beside the house and pipe it in. Those homes failed within 3 nights. Heat never rose. The earth stayed wet. The pressure failed. By New Year's, people were knocking on her door again. Only this time, not for refuge, but for corrections. "What did we do wrong?" asked the tanner. "Why won't the air rise?" asked the schoolteacher. "We copied your trench exactly," said the miller. Why's ours freezing over? Evelyn told them the truth, and she did not soften it. You cut the slope wrong, she said. Your vents are too wide. The air doesn't compress before rising. You didn't seal your ash layer, she told another. Your gravel's too loose. Heat escapes sideways. You didn't build above it. You built next to it, so the warmth doesn't reach the floor, just the yard. And more than once, she added, you didn't watch the wind? I told you to study the draft patterns. You thought it was just dirt. They hated hearing it, but they couldn't argue. Because her cabin still stood warm, no fire lit, the windows never frosting from the inside. Her children, 2 orphans she'd taken in from that first freeze, walked barefoot on the planks by the hearth, laughing, while grown men from town stood shivering in their boots and writing her instructions down like children in school. And that was when the real resentment took root. It started small, a broken latch on her gate, a trail of ash kicked down from her supply pile, the sudden disappearance of her old clay bucket, the one she used to test drafts near the hill's edge. Then someone cut the vent flap behind her root cellar. It was just a thin slit of leather stretched across a tunnel to block reverse drafts. Nothing large, nothing valuable. But without it, the cold began to pull downward through the system. Not enough to ruin the heat, but enough to unbalance it. She fixed it in silence, repacked the clay, replaced the flap with heavier canvas. But it happened again and again. By then, Evelyn no longer left her cabin alone. The boys, Thomas and Eli, were old enough to run into town for supplies. She gave them lists, exacting and spare, and trusted them to keep their heads low. But it wasn't long before they became targets too. The grocer shorted them sugar. The smith refused to repair their hinges. Even the preacher gave them a thin look when they passed by the chapel, muttering words Evelyn couldn't hear but felt just the same. It wasn't hate, not exactly. It was something deeper, embarrassment. They were the living proof that the rest of the town had been wrong, and nothing unsettles pride like a woman proving herself quietly, consistently, without any need for praise, especially when her success shamed everyone else's struggle. That spring, she stopped attending town meetings. That summer, she stopped sending her boys to town alone. And that fall, when another cold season loomed and no one dared speak of it yet, Evelyn Drew built something new, not beneath her home, but around it. She called it a veil trench, a circular ditch, dug 20 feet from the cabin's edge, lined with black stones and ash, capped with overlapping tiles of scavenged metal roofing. From above, it looked like a shallow moat filled with nothing. But in truth, it was a second airflow system, an interceptor. It captured crosswinds and redirected them under the cabin in a gentle vortex, creating positive pressure that forced internal warmth to stay sealed inside the cabin, even under shifting winds. It was invisible, silent, and made the house nearly airtight in warmth. When the freeze hit again, and this one did hit, harder than any yet, Evelyn's cabin held at 62 degrees, even when every thermometer in Ridgeway dropped to 12. Children wept in their parents' arms because their toes turned purple in their own beds. A woman lost her newborn in a cradle just 6 feet from the fire. And the last man who ever called Evelyn's system pointless stood outside her gate with no coat, no gloves, and tears running down his cheeks, begging for her to open the door. She did. Of course she did. She always did. But she never forgot. This time she made them watch, not just the warmth, but the work. She handed them shovels, made them dig with her, made them measure angles in the dirt, made them earn the knowledge they had once mocked. For the first time, the men of Ridgeway got their hands dirty trying to replicate what she had done. And slowly, they began to understand. It wasn't just about air and ash. It was about control, geometry, timing, trusting the slow movement of heat through things no one saw as useful. And most of all, it was about patience. Evelyn didn't want their praise. She wanted them to understand the earth beneath them, and some did, but not all. One night, just as the thaw began to crack the frozen ground, Evelyn heard something behind her cabin. The boys were asleep. She stepped outside with a lantern, slow and cautious. What she found was a man in a heavy coat, kneeling beside her veil trench, prying up the metal tiles and muttering to himself. He had a shovel strapped to his back and a satchel filled with loose sketches, her sketches. He'd copied them from the mayor's records, she realized. He wasn't there to learn. He was there to steal. When he saw her, he didn't run. He stood up straight, jaw clenched. It's public knowledge now, he said. You made your point. You got no right to keep it secret. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She only said, that trench is keeping 16 people warm right now. If you pull it wrong, the draft reverses and the cabin floods with cold. He hesitated, then dropped the tile. The clang echoed through the dark. He left without another word, and she knew it wouldn't be the last time. Because even success makes enemies, especially when it comes from the hands of someone no one thought worth listening to. The next freeze came without warning. No dusk buildup, no thunder over the ridge, no animal tracks shifting down early into the hollows. It dropped like a guillotine. 1 hour the puddles in town were melting under a weak sun. The next, a sheet of black ice had swallowed the paths, and smoke from stovepipes froze mid-twist in the air. No one expected it, and for once even Evelyn wasn't fully ready. Her trenches were packed, her seals had been checked, but the weight of that cold, the pressure of it, hit her roof like fists, the kind of cold that didn't just seep into your bones but cracked them, the kind of cold that screamed through keyholes and made grown men cry in their beds without knowing why. And it wasn't just the temperature. Something in it felt personal. The boys woke shivering, even under the quilts, not dangerously, just enough to know the balance had tipped. Evelyn rose without a word, wrapped her shawl, and stepped barefoot to the floor near the hearth. She crouched, pressed her palm flat against the boards, still warm, but slower. The drafts weren't pulling right. She lit the lantern and opened the hidden trap beneath the stove's base. The tunnel access no one knew about but her and the boys. And when she lowered herself in, the breath caught in her lungs. One of the vent mouths had collapsed, not from erosion, from cutting. The shape of the break was too clean. Not a sink, not a shift. Someone had found the upper trench line and struck the exit shaft with a tool, shattering the packed clay wall that helped regulate flow. It was sabotage. She spent the next hour in the dark, alone, sealing the breach with whatever she had: ash paste, cloth scraps, even a folded quilt that had frozen stiff from the last night's chill. Her fingers went raw from the clay. Her knees scraped across gravel. Her breath condensed on the roof of the crawl space and fell back down as mist. But she fixed it, just enough. By the time she rose back into the cabin, Thomas had stoked tea for the boys. Eli offered her the chipped cup without asking what had happened. They knew. She didn't say anything that day. Not to them, not to anyone. She simply made another note in her journal, wrapped the broken pieces of the air system in waxed cloth, and filed them into the crate beneath her bed, labeled failures. But it burned in her chest. Not the cold, the betrayal. Not long after she caught the name. It came from the grocer's daughter, whispering behind her father's stall when she didn't think Evelyn could hear. "They say the Whitlow boy did it," the girl muttered. "Tried to find out how it works. He said she doesn't deserve to keep it to herself." It wasn't Mark Whitlow, the loudmouth who'd first begged at her door 2 winters ago. It was his son, young, clever, and mean in a way his father never had been. He'd grown up watching Ridgway bend to Evelyn's design, and something in him couldn't take it. He tried to steal it. When that didn't work, he tried to break it. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat at the edge of the boys' bedroll and watched the flickering lamplight creep along the chinked logs of her walls. She remembered every moment of every hour she'd spent building this cabin, not hammering nails, not raising timber, but digging, shaping, listening to the earth shift and breathe beneath her hands. And now she realized something. What she had built wasn't just heat, it was independence. It was a kind of control that Ridgway had never accepted coming from a woman, especially not a widow, alone, childless by blood, who had taken in 2 orphans and made a warm world from ash and dirt. She was a threat, not because of her warmth, because of what it meant, that a woman with nothing could survive better than men with everything, and so they would never stop trying to own it or ruin it. And if she didn't do something now, they'd burn her out by spring. So she did something unthinkable. She invited the town, all of them. She left a notice on the church door, a second nailed to the tavern's beam, a third tucked under the mayor's carriage latch. It read, "You want to know how it works? Come see. 1 night only. Bring nothing. Leave your pride at home." There was no signature, but they knew who it was from. That night, 34 people climbed the ridge. Men, women, children wrapped in threadbare scarves. The preacher came too. Even Whitlow's son stood off to the side, stiff-backed and red-eared from embarrassment. And Evelyn opened her home. She did not smile. She did not greet them with tea. She simply lit 1 lantern and led them behind the cabin, to the ground. There she knelt in silence and began to dig, with her bare hands. And for the first time, Ridgway watched her work. Not the product, not the mystery, the work. She pulled back the packed turf that sealed the upper trench vents and let the draft flow outward. She traced their hands along the channels, explained the angle of slope, the shape of the clay walls, the reason the gravel had to be packed this way and not that. Then she brought them inside. She pulled up the planks over the inner ring, revealed the dome-like shape beneath, showed them the ash layers, the insulation pockets, the coiled paths of rising warmth that moved not in a straight line, but in slow spirals of pressure created by difference in temperature alone. Not magic, not chance. Physics, writ in dirt. "You want it?" she said finally. Her voice didn't rise. It settled in their ears like coals into a bed of embers. "Then earn it. Stop calling it luck. Stop calling it witchcraft. Stop acting like it's too strange to understand. This is work. That's all." She stood and left them there. No one followed her. They sat in silence, crouched in the glow of the floor, staring into the system as if it were a wound in the world. And when they finally left, none spoke a word. By the next winter, 7 homes on the outskirts of Ridgeway had their own variations of her design. None worked as well as hers, but they worked, enough to survive, enough to live, and those who had once mocked her never spoke against her again, not because they believed she was right, but because they knew now that her knowledge wasn't a trick or a spell or an accident. It was a weapon, and she had chosen to share it, but not to give it. There's a difference. That winter she got a letter, scrawled on a torn slip of paper, folded twice, and pushed under her door by someone who must have come in the night. The handwriting was rough. It read, "I cut the trench. I didn't understand what it was. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I'll never touch it again." There was no name, but she knew, and she burned the letter without saying a word. A week later, the townsfolk brought her something. Not a gift, not exactly. A ledger, a hand-bound book with blank pages, rough parchment, and the town seal pressed into the leather. They called it the Ridgeway Hearth Record, and they asked her to write her system down, not for them, but for the children, so it would not be lost, so it could not be forgotten. She agreed, but only on one condition. They would write their failures too. Every mistake, every cracked shaft, every flooded trench, every house that froze before they understood how to build it right. No legend, she said, no myth, just truth. And they did, page after page, and on the very first page, written in Evelyn Drew's own careful script, were the words, "This was not a miracle. This was desperation, patience, and dirt. Do not forget that." Years passed. The story didn't fade, but it changed. Children who hadn't lived through the freeze began hearing about the widow's warmth, like it was some strange fairy tale, the kind where a quiet woman built magic under her home and made the snow vanish. They didn't talk about the frostbite, or the shame, or the nights when Evelyn knelt in a trench alone, clawing through frozen soil with fingers so cracked they bled. They only saw the outcome. Even the preacher changed his tune. He once said heat that came without fire must be unnatural, something against God's will, but now he quoted her from the pulpit, called her system a blessing drawn from the wisdom of stillness, claimed the Lord had used her to humble the proud. Evelyn didn't argue. She was older now, her hands slower. Her boys, Thomas and Eli, were grown and nearly men in their own right. They'd learned her system inside and out, knew the patterns of wind in every season, knew how ash should smell when it settled right, knew how to adjust vents on the coldest nights when the wind shifted too fast. They'd become keepers of the warmth, not owners, not masters, but watchers, just like she'd been. One autumn morning, a man from a town west of the pass arrived in Ridgeway. He wore a thick overcoat and carried a knapsack with surveying tools. He said he was an engineer, or had been once, and he'd heard of the woman who heats without fire. He offered her money, a great deal of it, said he wanted to license the method, standardize it, patent it if she'd let him, said she could be rich, said towns beyond the mountains were desperate for cheap heating, said he could draw up diagrams, build models, have a blueprint stamped within the year. Evelyn listened, and then she said, "No." He was stunned, thought she hadn't understood. He explained it again. More money, more homes saved. She wouldn't have to lift a finger. Her name could go on the design. Evelyn's heat flow system, he said, like it was already etched on a brass plate, and she said no again. But she handed him the Ridgeway Hearth Record, told him to read, not copy, not print, read. He took it, grudging, left in silence. She never heard from him again. But 2 winters later, a letter came, postmarked from a mining camp near Bitteridge. It was signed by the same man, though now his tone was humbler. The letter read, "We built the system, followed it exactly. At first it failed. The men cursed. The design said it was nonsense. But I went back. I dug the trench myself, used ash, not soot, gravel, not stone, found the slope, found the draft. The cabin held at 47 degrees, in -15 weather. We didn't burn a thing. I believe now. I understand. Thank you." Evelyn folded the letter once and slipped it into the hearth record. No reply, no return address, just a small, private moment of peace. That same winter, Thomas returned home from a long trip into the valley towns. He'd taken to helping small communities build their own airflow systems, teaching what Evelyn had taught him. He never claimed credit, never charged. He slept on floors and ate from crusts and gave warmth to people who had only ever known smoke and flame. He came back thinner, older, but his eyes burned like his mother's once had. He brought news. A woman in Dust River had built her entire home around a central trench chamber, lined with slate, packed with salt ash, said it held warmth better than any iron stove, said she didn't know Evelyn Drew personally, but had heard whispers of the widow who cracked the cold. A man in Flint Hollow had built a sleeping floor over compressed clay channels and swore his children never felt frostbite again, said it was an underground lung, and he didn't know where the idea came from, but it worked. A preacher in Farband had begun spreading sermons about God's breath through earth, quoting parts of the Hearth record word for word, and in every town, folks spoke of it differently. Some called it science, some called it a miracle, some called it luck, but all of them said one thing: she did it first. Evelyn didn't go down the mountain again. She didn't need to. The world had come up to her, not to praise her, not to lift her name, but to build what she'd proven possible, and that was all she ever wanted. Because she remembered the early days, the crack in her voice from sleeping cold, the way the wind whistled under the floorboards like it was mocking her, the nights when she felt like one more snap of the wind would be enough to bury her for good. And she remembered the first time she pressed her hand to the floor and didn't feel cold, that silent moment of triumph no one else ever saw, that warmth that didn't come from a stove, but from stubbornness, from grief and loneliness and rage, and from the quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't crazy for thinking the earth could help her live. The last time Evelyn Drew stood in her trench, she didn't bring a shovel. She brought a cup of tea. She stood by the old vent mouth, watched the steam rise through the winter air, and smiled. The earth was still breathing. Her boys were warm. Her people had survived. And somewhere, far off in towns she'd never see, strangers were sleeping soundly above the very idea they once called pointless. Not because she forced them, but because she proved it. Not with words, not with arguments, but with heat. And no one could take that back. Not ever.